Hi, welcome to the Divine Insight Show. Thank you so much for joining us wherever and whenever you're doing so. I am very excited today to introduce you to my guest this week, Lisa Erickson. Lisa is an energy worker who specializes in women's energetics and sexual trauma healing, and she authored Chakra Empowerment for Women, which we're going to talk about today. She helps women maximize and balance their energy during key life transits, such as pregnancy, postpartum, perimenopause, and menopause, including balancing the mother-child energy line. She also works with women to heal emotional wounds on an energy level from abuse and assault. She's certified in mindfulness meditation instruction and trauma sensitivity, and has trained in a variety of healing modalities. She's a member of the International Association of Meditation Instructors, the American Holistic Health Association, the Energy Medicine Practitioners Association, and the Breath Network, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting holistic healing and healers for sexual trauma survivors. Lisa is passionate about helping any woman connect with their energy bodies, and she's here with me to talk today about her work and her book, Chakra Empowerment for Women. Lisa, thanks so much for being here with me today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Travis. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about all this.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I really appreciate your work and your time in joining me. I'm excited to share your work with listeners and viewers. Let's just dive in. Now, you talk about your work as sort of women's energetics. Can you talk a little bit about what this means?
Well, what I really focus in on is the ways that women's subtle bodies may differ from men's. And I want to say first that these differences are really on a spectrum. We understand gender now is largely a cultural phenomena. So people may identify on one or other end of the spectrum energetically, but there's more range energetically in how the chakras function than has previously been put forth. Mostly because as the teachings traveled to the West, they were primarily brought by men. And in terms of who wrote them down historically, they were written down by men. So it was kind of like men's subtle anatomy was presented as everyone's subtle anatomy, but there always were differences. If you go back into tantric texts, if you go back into different energy medicine traditions, they really do pull out the differences. So I was really trying to make that accessible for people today that are studying the chakras.
You know, that's really important, and I'm so grateful to hear about that, because as we talked before even the show started, being involved in this work many years myself, we very much learn a very singular way of understanding both the chakra systems, where they are, and how they work. So it's really great to understand these subtle distinctions that you described in your work, and I'm really excited to talk further about it. Why do you think these differences, or others that you talk about in your book, aren't more generally known or discussed in wellness communities?
I think it's really historical. We're just getting to that place where we're able to pull out these differences. A lot of these texts weren't translated into English for a long time. So I think, and it's interesting because even in the medical establishment in Western medicine, for a long time, really all the way into the 70s and into the 80s, pharmaceutical companies would only test, they wouldn't test pharmaceuticals separately on men and women. Even though we know that these differences in our reproductive system, which make up maybe 15 to 20% of our physical anatomy, like our heart and our stomach and all that is the same, right? But we have these physical anatomy differences, but those hormonal differences linked to those cascade through our whole physical body. There's differences in heart health for women, thyroid health for women. So pharmaceuticals, the same pharmaceutical will impact men and women differently. It's kind of the same at the subtle body level. It's that interface between our physical body and our spirit. So at the spirit level, it's pretty non-gendered. But at the level where the chakras connect to the physical body, there are real differences in those lower chakras. And I think they just didn't get brought forth primarily because the first teachers to come here were male yogis. And it's taken a while to catch up.
Yeah, and that's really, as someone who's been involved in like anti-oppression work for most of my career, we understand like the bias, the male bias of access to wisdom and lack of opportunity for women, and it's really something that is so frustrating to see. But you know, being male privileged myself, obviously I don't have that disadvantage, but it's something that is so good for people to understand and utilize in their lives, because it can be so powerful. And I'm really curious, what about people who identify as maybe they're transmen or women, or pan, or maybe non-binary, or those who just don't fit into our gender stereotypes?
Yeah. I mean, my experience is that the energy body part that someone will identify with is however they identify gender wise. So someone who is biologically male but identifies as female, generally they are going to relate to the teachings that I'm giving about women's energy bodies. They're going to relate to the differences in the second chakra in particular that way. Now, it's not always the case. And I think part of what these teachings do is open up this spectrum of how the chakras function. And it actually helps someone to understand maybe they have always felt their energy function differently than what was being described to them. And this now helps to explain why in terms of the spectrum. So I think someone who identifies pan or transgender may associate with both ends of the spectrum, with everything that I'm saying at different times. Like, that's really how it plays out. So I don't really claim to know all the answers, but I think that it opens up the conversation regarding how our energy bodies function and how that relates to gender.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's so important for people to understand the distinction between one's biology and maybe their psychology, their emotion, and psychosocial identity with respect to how their gender expresses in themselves. You know, we understand in the West and the US in particular, those doctors only have 2 boxes on that form when the baby's born, and they look at the genitalia, they measure it, and they're told, okay, if it's 1.5 inches shorter, that's a woman. And so you're going to modify that person, you know, and then and destroy their bodies in a way to conform to what we expect. And then that might not be true for them. And so to understand that distinction between that physiology and the identity and how they relate to their energy bodies is so important. And I'm so glad that you talk about it, and it is something we need to be so open to. How then do you suggest those who are women, identify as women, work on her energy body and chakras than a man? How would you suggest that they do that?
Yeah, well, in general, the main difference, or the main point of reference for the differences, is that a woman's energy body tends to be anchored in the second chakra, in the womb area, the cervix womb area, as opposed to the root chakra, which is the traditional teaching, right? And again, it's a spectrum, there's variations. But I really work with the second, the heart, and the third eye, those even chakras, as the feminine pathway in all of us. And the root, third chakra, throat, and crown as the male pathway in all of us. And we're all yin and yang, masculine and feminine. But for a woman then, her energy body is anchored in that feminine pathway of that second chakra, which has nothing to do with saying that her purpose is procreative, right? That can really rub contemporary women the wrong way, as it kind of did for me when I first started to read these teachings. I didn't really relate to teachings around womb wisdom and this kind of thing that you would find in a lot of women's spirituality, because it felt limiting. It felt like defining women, putting this in another box, right? So, but the reality is, once you really connect with this as being the anchor for your body, it helps you understand the differences. And one of the differences is that a woman's energy waxes and wanes with her cycle and with her different reproductive phases of her life. And if you understand that, you can work with it. And it also, because that chakra is centripetal, it's kind of an inward receiving chakra in both men and women. The fact that women's energy bodies are anchored there means we do tend to absorb energies more readily. We tend to be more suggestible in terms of others' emotions. Of course, empaths can be both male or female for sure, but women's energy bodies by default tend to take in others' emotions and process them. And until they become aware of that, they may be really prone to processing others' emotions as if they're their own. And then conditioning feeds into that as well, right? That girls are still conditioned to value their worth around their relationships more than boys. I have boy-girl twins, so I see this very clearly even today. And so that also impacts it. So I think this gives you a doorway in to understanding boundaries and your cycles. And that's really what I work with women on.
Yeah, thank you. That's really fascinating. I'm also interested, you know, when we talk about, you know, sort of the spiritual nomenclature, when it comes to accessing our divine sense of connection, is usually a feminine trait, right? We're talking about receiving, meditating, which is to receive. We're accessing our divine feminine sacred feminine power and kind of female centric forces. How does your work connect with that sort of language and dialogue?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of these teachings on the second chakra can help both men and women learn to relate to the sacred in that yin way, and to really break down some of the conditioning that we have around power, especially. And there's a lot of myths around that, around power and spirituality. We can internalize the idea that somehow being spiritual means being weak or being passive or only being receptive, as opposed to being powerful in the world, that somehow the material world, and this is very Judeo-Christian, that somehow the material world and spirituality is different. And then there's so much denigration of feminine energies that spirituality can be almost internalized as if it's our weak side. Or sexuality, of course, we have tons of problems with that sexuality and spirituality are somehow separate. So I think working with the divine feminine, whether you're male or female, and really working with the second chakra as being a doorway into that feminine pathway for both men and women, opens up this doorway, especially when it comes to embodiment. Because that's the other duality we create, that somehow spirituality is about transcending the body, as opposed to recognizing the body itself as spiritual and sacred. And that, more than anything, is what the second chakra means to me. It means embodiment of, you know, truly the body as sacred and spiritual.
That's really beautiful. And I can really relate, being as someone who's worked in, you know, in human resources, in the employment sort of atmosphere, and many of us in the employment atmosphere, you know, it can a lot of times be an environment that supports or you know, not necessarily glamorized, but generally is like male oriented and masculine oriented. And the whole concept of talking about getting into our divine can be very, you know, if you think about like toxic masculinity in the workplace, it's like, absolutely not. I am a man, and you know, power, control, authority, yang, yang, yang. And that's, I think that's why mindfulness practices is so much more prevalent right now than meditation, even though they're quite similar, if not the same thing. So it's really interesting that you know, talk about that in a more practical way, particularly in your work, that we all kind of ebb and flow in those, you know, the relationship, the way in which we relate, which is so important. And I'm curious, you know, you talk, you know, about it about the energetic shifts that women experience along with the physical shifts tied to menstruation, pregnancy, and menopause. Can you elaborate a little bit on what those energetic shifts are?
Yeah. So our menstrual cycle, our hormones wax and wane with our cycle, right? And we know this, and we know there's a real shift in our pheromones and all that kind of thing throughout our cycle. It does impact our moods emotionally, and being really present with that is really important. Our second chakra really sort of opens and closes. It really becomes very emanating as we shift into ovulation, and then it becomes very sort of inward pulling as we move into menstruation. And female mystics throughout the ages would work with these cycles, right? That the ovulation was this time of like creation and moving outward in the world. That's the time to do a speech, or, you know, really focus on emanating or creating something. And then moving into your period is a time to move inward for contemplation, to see the next steps. It's a time of seeing, right? Now, in today's world, we can't structure our life around that. But if you're aware, you at least know, oh, okay, right now I actually need more boundaries and I need more time to myself, right? I just need at least 10 minutes a day. Or at this time, I'm going to be very outward facing, and I'm going to be very social. And you can work with these cycles in a way that's empowering. And then this cycle becomes empowering. Now, I would say men also have these cycles. We're coming to understand the hormonal cycles of men as well. It's just not as magnified, right? It's not as obvious.
Not as dynamic.
So, yeah, and so I encourage men too to kind of figure this out. We were realizing men kind of have a menopause as well in terms of hormonal shifts that happen in the 40s and 50s, and so I think there's a lot of crossover.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I want to shift gears just a little bit, because I know you have a lot of experience and you work with trauma and trauma survivors. So how does trauma impact our energy body?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of patterns that I see, but I think the main one are patterns of disassociating from the lower chakras. And especially because I work a lot with sexual abuse and assault survivors, both men and women. And there will be a tendency often to disassociate from the lower chakras, partially because they're associated with the parts of our body that may have been violated through the abuse, partially because the body doesn't feel safe. And we know that childhood abuse survivors will develop strategies for surviving an abuse episode where they kind of leave their bodies. It may be astral, it may be just sort of shutting down. You know, this is what is technically referred to as disassociation. What I find on the energy body level, what that often means is someone lives up in their upper chakras. And I'm interested to hear if you see this. One of the main patterns that I see, because the people who come to me for chakra work for trauma are by definition spiritual and energetic in nature, they may be very well developed in their third eye and their crown, but in many cases are spiritually bypassing because they're more comfortable up here as opposed to in their body. So their chakra system is not grounded in this lower chakras. And a lot of my work is about helping them get down into those lower chakras and ground all of this upper chakra energy and abilities that they've developed in their body and in that, so they can function in the world and have boundaries and all of those things that we need.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. Well, I'm kind of like the unicorn amongst unicorns, I'll call it. I had my own birth-death trauma and survived a traumatic birth, but then also being a sexual abuse survivor in my early 20s, had my own experiences with that. And then coupled with the fact that I don't have any earth in my astrological chart, I'm all upper chakra anyway. So, grounding has been something I've been challenged with my entire life. But to your question about that, you know, in my experience, yes, I've definitely observed a very similar pattern with people that have gone through trauma, is that we have the psychological effect, which is we want to be safe, and then our ego creates a belief system around how do we do that. And then if that, you know, all the mechanisms that you described, shutting down, going out, whatever that looks like for us. But also, you know, as we understand about our consciousness, there are all of these sort of things that we don't necessarily see, but they're environmental factors that existed at the time of the abuse that now we're sort of on edge about. And any of these environmental factors or cues can pop in, and suddenly we're I don't use the term triggered, but I use the term cued, because I don't think of us as guns. I think of us as people, and we get cued up to react or to be in fear, and we don't. And then all of a sudden we're like, whew, I'm on high alert, and I'm not sure why. Where's the dinosaur? Where's the threat? And so it's so important, particularly around trauma, because so many of us have been traumatized, to really understand that some of the classic ways in which we work with the energy bodies might need a little bit more care or attention in ways that other people might not experience. I'm really curious though, in your experience, have you observed a difference between the impacts on women versus men with respect to trauma or sexual trauma?
Yeah, I feel as if, there's a range, but I feel as if men tend to disassociate emotionally more and women perhaps physically more. I also find one pattern that is more prevalent in men, although I see it in both men and women, is to really lock into the navel chakra, almost like I'll never be vulnerable again. And so someone might be highly successful actually in their life. No one would ever guess from the outside that they were ungrounded or anything like that, because they're really all navel chakra. Well, and I use the navel chakra as opposed to the solar plexus, but same thing. It's ruling that whole area. Personal power, right? Very personal power, very will, very determination oriented, but that's completely exhausting because it's not sourced from the root and the sacral. There's no flow. It's like the root and sacral are on lockdown, and it's all about just push, push, push in the navel. I'll never be vulnerable again. Lots of walls. And so then it really becomes about almost kind of unlocking the navel and allowing flow, allowing pleasure, which is the second chakra, allowing safety in the body, as opposed to this always triggered high power state.
Beautiful. And Thank you. There's so much I would love to go in deeper about that.
Yeah.
But I do want to talk a little bit about, a little bit more, diving deeper into the spiritual disassociation that you've discussed in the context of energy body trauma reactions. Can you talk a little bit more about how that works energetically?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few different things that can happen. If someone someone can be totally disconnected from their lower chakras, and they just have a tendency whenever they are cued, I like that word, to almost leave, like they have a place that they go, and they're still here talking, but they don't feel fully present. And it's really almost a soul retrieval type work. I don't necessarily call it that. I really call it like coming back. I almost view it like the energy body is floating like a balloon just slightly above the physical body, and we need to bring it down and anchor the subtle body into that root chakra. I think that's one of the main things. That's really almost always the main work. And then increasing someone's window of tolerance. What happens is someone will kind of put their energy body on lockdown. They'll only allow stimuli within a certain range. Maybe they deny themselves pleasure. Maybe they only relate to their body sexually. It could be one or the other. And it's really about opening them up to all the other energies of the second chakra in particular, because that's creativity, sensuality, sexuality, pleasure of all types in our body. So, and emotions, comfort with emotions. So it's about gradually increasing that window of tolerance. So then there's always self-protective walls, right? Someone will have walls built up in their heart, or sometimes even in their, third eye. Throat is a big one, because if someone has had to keep their abuse secret, there's sort of this lid there of, there's this part of me that I'll never speak, right? And if you do that, it really creates issues here. So it can manifest in a variety of different ways throughout the energy body. And you kind of work with it. I kind of work with it where I see it.
Yeah, thank you. As you were describing that, I was just remembering all the different ways in which we've seen people you talked about it as almost a soul retrieval, which in my work, I actually do have times when I'll go back, but a soul retrieval is sort of the way that I use it. It's more like, hey, there's been an aspect of someone's past life trauma that occurred where an aspect of their soul literally disconnects from the collective. And now in this consciousness, they're not fully empowered in some way or second guess themselves. So we need to go back and sort of release that soul part from whatever story or narrative or event occurred. But that the imagery that you're talking about of that sort of projection of the out of body experience is almost like what you see when you think about, the shaman's day walking. I've left the body, and there's just a silver strand between me and the physical body, and I'm like an automaton. Just the mouth keeps moving, but I'm not really here. So I think people, it's a protection mechanism, and it's not you're not weak. If this has been your experience, I think that's really an important thing for people to understand, is that it's not a weakness, it's a protection.
Yes.
And there are ways that you can heal from that experience, and there are ways in which that experience, actually benefited you in some way that you might not have access to immediately. But I'm fascinated as well about your talk about, in the context of our psychic and spiritual development, we all understand in the spiritual world, the dialogue around it, that we have this Kundalini energy, that goes from the base of our sit bones up our spine, and like a serpent up into our pineal gland and back. Some people observe that as this bright blue electric energy, and we've often described it as our divine spiritual psychic energy healing source. How does the Kundalini energy fit within the context of both women's energetics and trauma healing?
Yeah. Well, I'll speak to the latter first, the trauma, because it's interesting, because as the Kundalini rises, whether it does so through explicit techniques to try to do it, or spontaneously because of life events or astrology transits, there's a lot of things that can, I think, trigger surges in the Kundalini. It can release traumas that have been sort of stored away as a self-protective mechanism. And I find that when we talk about Kundalini crisis, that's often what's happened. The Kundalini rising really most of the time is a very natural, beautiful, peaceful process. It's not scary or dangerous, right? It leads to all these wonderful, pleasurable feelings. When it does lead to problems, whether it's physical or mental, emotional instability, feelings of instability or crisis in some sense, it's often because there has been some unfaced trauma in this life or another, or ancestral, intergenerational, right? The person may not always even be aware of it. So when someone comes to me feeling like they've been experiencing Kundalini crisis, that's the first thing I go to, is to try to explore, is there something that's being called to be healed? Because the job of the Kundalini is essentially to awaken us. Its job is to push to the surface anything that's obstructing our realization of ourself as light, right? So if we've pushed something down, like I can't handle this, which is essentially what trauma is, right? It's Kundalini's job is to bring it up. So that's one perspective I have on Kundalini and trauma. And I think it also means anyone consciously trying to bring the Kundalini up who has experienced trauma should be very gentle with themselves and never feel as if they need to push. Just be gentle and allow it, pay attention to pace, pay attention to pacing. But that's a lot. I can go into the other question now with women, or do you want to stop there for a moment?
Well, I think that really answers it. I mean, I think if there are anything specific, I think that women should pay attention to with respect to the differences in what you've just described, then I think that might be helpful to just highlight.
Yeah. Well, because women tend to be centered in their second chakra, that's really where the Kundalini is sourcing from. And so it can be a very different experience for men and women as the Kundalini rises. It's a much more Shakti experience for women often. Often the progression may feel more like emotional expansiveness as opposed to this rising up type of feeling. So I think that's one thing. The other thing that's interesting is that perimenopause, which is kind of the 5 to 10 year phase that most women experience in their 40s, moving into menopause, is actually a time when the Kundalini does these little surges spontaneously as our system reorients from this physical cycle that it's had monthly for so long, really into our energy body. I mean, what menopause really is this opportunity to shift from being tied to this physical cycle to our energy body. So there are these surges of Kundalini that correspond to that during perimenopause. That's really what hot flashes are. They're a big piece of it. There's hormonal things related to it. And if women understand that, then they can sort of embrace it as this pathway to growth during that time, as opposed to the way the medical system views it, which is a problem.
Yeah, you're now dying.
Yeah, exactly. You're on your way to death. You're on your way out.
Yeah.
Your shelf life is you're expiring is essentially almost what women feel like. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that elaboration. One of the things that I know is that we're in such trying and challenging times right now. And, we're coming into an election year. People are on high alert just generally with all the events and events that, are happening. We learn about things so quickly with our phones, with notification after notification, and there's a lot of fear and hatred out there. And I built this show really around trying to help people provide opportunities for transformational tools for people and exercises that can really help people be their best selves and live their best lives. And what I love about your book is that you include very specific, practical and easy to use and apply exercises that people can really experience shifts in their bodies and lives. And just given where we are right now, is there anything that comes to mind right now that you might recommend that viewers or listeners do right now to really transform themselves and grow spiritually?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can all use right now is energetic boundaries. With the growth of social media, I think we're all really overstimulated. And then with the heightened political environment, there is so much intensity all the time and such a feeling of crisis. And we really have to be able to create an energetic filter to kind of stay contained within that. And I really view that as both root and navel chakra based. One of the tools in the book is called the second skin. And this is something for both men and women. Very simple tool to just kind of connect the energies of the root and the navel chakra and imagine them creating a filter all around your body. on top of your skin. And it's just you can sense other people's emotions if you wish to without taking them into your body. That is the really essential shift, especially for anyone, that's likely to listen to your show, because they're likely natural empaths, right? They very naturally feel. And so this is a very simple way. And it's another reason that it's so important to get grounded in those lower chakras, because if you're not, you can't protect your energy body. You can't do this filter. You can have your third eye and your crown very well developed, and if you're up there, it feels as if you're not absorbing the energies of others, but your energy body still is, and then it often manifests as illness or other things like that. So I think boundaries are really essential right now, and equanimity, which is the heart, really being able to just center and find that still point right in the center of your heart, from which you're non-judgmental. You're able to not judge everything instantly from a reactive place. It's really the chakra version of mindfulness, of just trying to be what is, and it's just right there in the center of our heart, which is very interesting, right? Because we think of the heart as being love and emotions, and it is all of those things, but right behind that is just this center point of equanimity. And our society is not very equanimous. So being able to find that within yourself is essential.
Yeah, I mean, the science that, we've learned, and, I've had guests on my show that have talked about heart coherence. I've had Greg Braden, and all the science around when we connect with our heart energy, even placing our hand on our heart brings our attention and our consciousness into that area of our bodies. Even doing so for just a couple of minutes will calm the nerves, center the self, and bring the attention and consciousness and energy into our heart space. So I love that. And boundaries, absolutely. So great. And I really appreciate that. Really important reminder to separate yourself from your phone in the day, separate yourself from others, and figure out what's going on with me versus what's going on over there. We talk about that, not my circus, not my monkeys. And I often will tell clients in my classes, I have a workshop coming up even this week, karma of relationships. And it's like, what's mine is mine. What's yours is yours.
Yes.
I have enough on my plate. And so really focusing on that. And I really appreciate that wonderful tip. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about your work or your book with viewers or listeners right now?
Yeah, I think another component of it is energy line work in terms of the mother-child line is very interesting, parent-child line, relationship lines, sexual lines, the different ways we exchange energy with people. And what made me think of that is what you were just saying around your stuff is yours and my stuff is mine. And there's a technical aspect to that as well, especially when we're in relationship, the ways that we share energy across these lines and learning to gain some control over that. And doing that technically, there's the emotional, psychological component of it, and there's the technical component of kind of learning how to close a line so you can just feel solitude when you need to. And women in particular tend to process their male partners, if they're in a heterosexual relationship, their male partner's emotions. That has to do with conditioning, men being conditioned to kind of shut down their emotions, women to take them on. So that is a very prevalent pattern. And I think in all kinds of relationships, there tends to be one partner or another that is processing the emotions for both of them. It's a common pattern. So that's always another piece of the puzzle to kind of learn to work with and see that dance we all play in our relationships.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. And how can people reach you, get more information about you or your work?
The book Chakra Empowerment for Women is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Llewellyn and all that, and hopefully in bookstores. So go look for it and tell them to get it if they don't have it, from Llewellyn Publishing. And then I'm on Facebook as Chakra Empowerment, and also on Instagram as Chakra Empowerment. And the website is Chakra Empowerment for Women. And on Twitter, I'm Mommy Mystic, which is also my blog name. Although my kids are all teenagers now and they no longer call me Mommy, I'm still under Mommy Mystic. So
that's awesome. And again, the book we're talking about is Chakra Empowerment for Women. And I hope that you go and get it. And thank you so much, Lisa, for your time and being with me today. And thank you all for watching and viewing. And have yourselves a wonderful week.
Thank you, Travis.
You're welcome.